Hi there, it's Mrs F with my video on changes in German society between 1924 and 1929. Although I'm following the Edexcel specification, you'll find that a lot of the content is also relevant to other exam boards. So, last time we finished looking at the recovery of the Weimar Republic between 1924 and 29. And this time we're going to look at changes in society. Ordinarily, I would cover each bullet point in a separate lesson, but I'm going to be looking at all three aspects in today's lesson. So we're going to begin by having a look at whether there was an improvement in the standard of living. Unemployment had been a major problem in the early years of the Weimar Republic, and in 1924, over 4% of the total possible workforce was unemployed. However, there were gradual improvements during this time. Between 1926 and 1928, unemployment dropped from 2 million to 1.3 million. Furthermore, help for the unemployed improved. The Unemployment Insurance Act of 1927 charged 16.4 million workers 3% of their wages, and in return it provided an average of 60 marks per week in unemployment and sickness benefits if they fell out of work. Another improvement that took place was for work wages and working conditions. The length of the working week shortened. In 1925, workers worked an average of 50 hours per week, but this had dropped to 46 hours by 1927. But at the same time, real wages, which is the actual value of goods that your wages could buy, actually rose by 25% from 1925 to 1928. So people were working shorter hours for better wages. Housing was another area of improvement, and it needed it. By 1923, there was a shortage of 1 million homes in Germany. So in 1925, a 15% rent tax was introduced to help fund building associations. And from 1925 to 1929, private companies built 37,000 new homes, and the new building associations built 64,000 homes. This meant that although there was still a housing shortage, it had somewhat eased by 1928. War veterans were also offered help. Under the 1920 Reich pension law, pensions were paid throughout the 1920s to 750,000 war veterans, 400,000 war widows, and 200,000 parents of dead servicemen. Education also improved. The number of students in higher education before the First World War was 70,000, but by 1928 this had increased to 110,000. So I think overall we can say yes, there was an improvement in the standard of living, but we must bear in mind that employment did remain insecure, and the loss of savings during hyperinflation continued to cause hardship, particularly for the middle classes. We're now going to have a look at the changes in society that took place for women. In the very first week of the Weimar Republic, the government gave women the vote and the right to stand in elections, and women took full advantage of these rights. In the Weimar elections, the turnout of women voters was 90%, which is really high. By 1932, 112 women had been elected to the Reichstag. By 1932, almost 10% of members were female. The Weimar Republic also strengthened the rights of women. Article 109 of the Weimar Constitution said that women had equal rights with men, that marriage was an equal partnership, and that women should be able to enter all professions on an equal basis with men. Now, although there was some progress, it's worth pointing out that with women making up 10% of the Reichstag by 1932, this is still a lot lower than their proportion in the population. I mean, really, they should make up about 50% of the members of the Reichstag. The situation for women at work was a lot more mixed. In 1918, 75% of women were in work, often doing jobs previously performed only by men as they went off to fight in the First World War. And then in the 1920s, many part-time jobs were created in the expanding retail and service sector, for example in shops and offices. There was progress for women in the liberal professions of education and medicine. For example, the number of female doctors rose from 2,500 to about 5,000 between 1925 and 1932. However, in some ways, under the Weimar Republic, the lives of women actually returned to the way they had been pre-war. So by 1925, only 36% of women were in work, which was about the same as pre-war levels. And even though women and men were supposed to be treated equally in the workplace, this did not happen. So for example, in jobs where men and women did the same work, women were paid on average 33% less than men. Women were also expected to give up work once they were married, which shows that traditional gender stereotypes were still very much in force. Finally, few women entered high-status professions. By 1933, there were only 36 female judges in Germany. One of the social changes of the 1920s was the emergence of the so-called New Woman. For some women, especially young, unmarried working women living in the cities and where there were job opportunities, the 1920s brought them more financial independence. And because they'd grown up during the war, they were also used to having greater social independence. These new women brought more clothes and they went out more. And they showed their independence by wearing their hair short, by wearing more makeup, more jewellery and more revealing clothes. They smoked and drank more and went out unaccompanied, which would have been seen as quite shocking pre-war. There were differing attitudes towards the emergence of the new woman. So some women felt liberated by the new opportunities and freedoms. The birth rate began to fall. In 1913, there were 128 live births each year per 1,000 women, but by 1925, this had fallen to 80. And the divorce rate was rising. In 1913, there were 27 divorces each year per 100,000 people, but by the 1920s, this had risen to 60. Now, you might say that rising divorce rates are a bad thing, and of course the breakdown of a marriage is sad, but what this actually showed was that women now had the ability to leave marriages if they were unhappy. And also, instead of being baby machines, they could choose to access contraception in order to have smaller families. And some men were actually quite accepting of these changing roles for women. There were, however, opponents of new women. Some women themselves were actually daunted by the expectation that they should change and were happy with the role of wife and mother. And as you can imagine, traditionalists were very upset by the falling birth rates and rising divorce rates. They said that women should concentrate on being mothers and wives. Interestingly, trade unions also opposed women workers and equal pay and conditions. They were worried that employers would think they could get away with paying women less, in terms of their wages, and that this would drive down how much men got instead. And they were also worried that women might take their jobs. In the 1920s, several factors caused a surge of artistic and cultural energy. First of all, the restrictions of the old regime under the Kaiser disappeared once he had abdicated in 1918. And the new Weimar Constitution gave legal protection to freedom of speech and expression, so people had to have less fear of censorship. And lastly, the economic recovery after 1924, which we associate with Stresemann, helped to create the wealth that was, of course, needed to finance the arts. A number of new ways of looking at the arts emerged. Firstly, there was new objectivism. The idea that the arts should not show a romantic view of the world, but should show life as it really was, including poverty and squalor. There was also modernism. The idea that the arts should not always hark back to the past, but should instead embrace the future and see beauty in cities, industry, and technology. And then there was expressionism, the idea that the arts should reflect the thoughts and feelings of the artist, rather than being limited to showing things exactly as they really look. In the painting, which you see on the right hand of the screen, this was produced by Otto Dix in 1927. It's expressionist in style, and it also shows new objectivism, looking at the harsh life of war veterans and what the artist saw as falling standards of behaviour in Germany's nightlife during the Weimar Republic. We'll now have a look at some examples of the cultural boom, and we'll start with art. The painting, which you see on the left-hand side of the screen, is by George Gross, and it's called Grey Day. This was a scene that is critical of German life. He used expressionist images of people to show the boredom of everyday life. Next, if we have a look at the Einstein Tower by Erich Mendelsohn, this shows a new architectural movement called the Bauhaus movement. When Mendelsohn was asked to design the Einstein Tower, which is an observatory in Potsdam, he designed a futuristic tower which looks like a rocket. It was unlike anything seen before. The Bauhaus style stressed beauty and technology, simple lines, and careful craftsmanship. If we turn now to cinema, at the bottom there you can see a poster for Fritz Lang's 1926 film Metropolis. This was a science fiction film about life and technology in the 20th century. It was financed by a government-funded agency called the UFA. German films became popular all over the world in the 1920s, and it was seen as a country where innovative cinematic techniques were being tried out. Lastly, there was a boom in literature during this period. Erich Remarque's gritty, realistic anti-war novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, sold 500,000 copies in just 3 months, and was itself adapted into a film. Not everyone approved of these extreme changes in the arts. Those on the left wing, for example the communists, said the funding was money spent on extravagance, when working people still needed basic help. Whilst the extreme right wing, for example the Nazis, said that the changes undermined traditional German culture. So we have now finished looking at key topic 1, the Weimar Republic between 1918 and 1929. Next time, we're going to start topic 2, Hitler's rise to power, and we'll be looking at the early development of the Nazi Party. I'll hopefully catch you next week. Goodbye.